again. This time we'll be talking about presentation tools, basically how we get our ideas across, how we make them effective, how we engage. Again, we have the problem. We only have 20 minutes, and there's no way we can go into anything in great detail. I will, however, spend a little bit of time at a practical level talking about color, because in this day and world, color plays such an important role, not only in terms of color photography, in terms of graphic design, in terms of our perceptions. Color is a key element. It affects us psychologically and obviously is a very important communication tool. So let's begin. I mean, the photograph you're looking at is a picture I took many years ago at a mental hospital called Himayatpur in Patna. It was a peephole in the violent ward, people looking at me. And essentially, the reason I'm using this picture is because I think at every point, you need to be thinking about who the viewer is. And depending upon who the viewer is, you have to change the way you tell your story. You will not tell the story in the same way to a 5-year-old as you will to a room full of professors. It just won't work. And those are adjustments you constantly need to make. You've got great content, brilliant story, wonderful visuals, all those sort of things, but you put it up online and it takes forever to download. People will run off. No one has the patience to wait for things, that circling apple or whatever it is, that whirlwind that goes around, is the worst thing that you want your audience to see, and they just do not have the patience. So you will lose your audience. So that's one thing you have to consider. If your video breaks up, again, it doesn't matter how good it is. If it's a broken video, it's a broken video. People don't have the patience. People are scanners. Long-form reading is dying, and it's a much faster-paced world than it used to be. People have less time. So you need to be able to get to them in the brief moment that you have. And if you have boring design, well, it's boring. People get turned off. So you really need to be very alert to all those possibilities. While on the one hand, those things turn you off, on the other, really stunning design draws people to things. And you could have subjects which are less important, but you could draw them. I mean, ideally, we want to have good subjects. We want to have we have important things to say, but we need to find the mechanism to get that in. So you have to do your homework. The first is to understand your audience. As I mentioned before, a room full of kids is a very different audience to a room full of professors. People may have different interests. People might be there for different purposes. They have come for a particular purpose, and you need to understand what that purpose is. They have given their time, perhaps their money, to listen to you. They want to get their values worth. And at the end of the day, what's the point of the exercise if you switch people off? So ask yourself that question. Why are you there? You're there because you have something which you want to deliver, which presumably they want to listen to. They want to understand. They want to get it across. It's a message where both players are important, the messenger and the receiver. But you need to know what that chemistry is. One thing to also remember is, before they go, give them something to go away with. Have them go with a takeaway, a certain point. If you inundate him with lots of ideas, it'll just get lost. Often, it's just one concrete idea, one specific action that you want people to take, that you want people to move towards. If in some way you have been able to transform your audience into an engaged audience that is motivated towards a specific action, that's the best any speaker can hope for. So let's move on. I mean, one of the things which is important to remember is how is your content being consumed? Here I am talking to you. I don't know how you're watching me, whether you have a large screen that you're seeing it on, or whether it's a tiny little screen on your mobile phone. In all probability, it is your mobile phone, because that is the most prevalent screen there is, and that is how most of media today is consumed. So it would be meaningless for us to design something that works in large format only, that has nuances that just get lost in the smaller versions that we have. Ideally, you want things that can survive in both, but at the least, the common denominator is it needs to work on a mobile. If your message is to get across, it has to be mobileable. So that's one. You also need to think of how you get those messages across. Simple messages are always the best. And there is a saying, simple is hard, easy is harder, invisible is hardest. And that's really when you've excelled, when you are no longer there, when your message goes across so powerfully, so effectively, they are so immersed in your ideas that you, the messenger, are irrelevant. That's when you've actually succeeded. So try and get your ideas across so powerfully that the ideas themselves are the carriers. And I say it, but it's not easy. Simple design is always much more difficult. Whether it be written text, whether it be graphic design, whether it's a photograph, ideas that jump across are the ones that work the most. And it's worth remembering. So we'll spend a little bit of time going on color theory, because it's so central to so many other things, and it's something I actually want to show you in practice. There is a difference between how photographers see color theory and how graphic designers see color theory, and we don't have the luxury of going into the intricacies of that. But when we deal with light, we deal with three primary colors: red, green, and blue. And the reason we do that is because that is how we see. Our eyes have three types of receptors: red, green, and blue receptors. Therefore, the world that we see is translated by our brain in terms of those three colors, and that's what makes them primary colors. It's not the same when it comes to printing, because they work with subtractive colors. So what they use is the color that remains when you have white light, which is everything. From there, if you remove red, you're left with cyan. If you remove blue, you're left with yellow. If you take out green, you're left with magenta. Now, the combination of yellow, magenta, and cyan does not give black. It gives a murky, muddy brown. So in order to get good contrast, in order to make sure that we get the full range of tones of our images, and certainly if you're into black and white printing, if you want to get that beautiful lushness of silver, the blackness of silver, you need to add black to yellow, magenta, and cyan to really get those densities. But let's talk of primary colors. What we have here are three bowls, one with blue dye, one with green dye, one with red dye. Essentially, we've just taken those three and diluted them somewhat, put them in, and what we're going to try and do now is a little experiment. We'll take white light and we shine it through these three, and if our theory is right, we should end up with white light at the other end. So let's make it happen. Okay, turn it on. So essentially we have three primary colors, red, green, and blue, in roughly the same proportion in those three bowls. Earlier on we just mixed some dye and diluted it so the light would pass through. The three together with white light going through becomes white again at the other end. The combination of the three primary colors in the same ratio ends up with white light. And that essentially is what you need to know about to understand color. There is psychology to go with it, there are other aspects. So essentially, if you've got the three primary colors in the same proportion, the combination of that light leads to white light. That's the essence of color. One of the reasons we spent so much time on color is because color plays such an important role in people's perceptions towards an image. It's used in advertising very extensively, and research shows that 60 to 90% of snap decisions are made on the basis of color perceptions. So if we want to get ideas across, if we want to be convincing in our argument, we need to understand how to use color. The other things we'll talk about are typography. Again, it's not simply the content of my text, but the graphic elements of the text, how they work together, how the images engage with the audience, the flow of our eyes as we go through. As I'd mentioned before, we are scanners, and intelligent use of design and typography makes a big difference. Layout, composition, and balance are also important things, particularly when it comes to the printed page. So we will have to give importance there as well. When it comes to color, one of the things to do is to keep it simple. Understanding which colors work with each other, which colors jar, which colors do not match well, are important in order to get your ideas across, in order to get the right perception across. It's good to use the color wheel. You have the position of the complementary colors, the primary colors, which work with others, what colors are adjacent to other colors, and that makes it easier to have batches of colors. If you have a color scheme, then it's good to know the color wheel to find out what are the colors that gel together and which are the colors that stand out or contradict one another. Saturation and hue are important things. And again, I'm going to use examples because this is something where people often get confused. So I have red dye here, and I'm going to pour in water, which is clear, which is colorless. And as I do that, watch what happens. Now, this red is considerably lighter than this red, but it's actually the same color. The density has changed, the color itself has not. And that's important to remember. We often confuse the two. Because we added water, we didn't alter the purity of the color. This color is as pure when it is light as it was when it was deep. The density has changed. Let's now do something else. Whoops, I've still got a bit of color sticking to it, but that won't matter. Milk is white. It has a combination of all the colors, and as we pour it in, what we will effectively be doing is adding other colors to the existing color. So while the red is still there, the proportion of red here is far less than here. Here, it's a lighter red, but it's still red. It's pure. The color, the hue is as it was. Here, what we've done effectively is we've actually even added more red. But because we've also added equal amounts of green and blue, the proportion of red here is far less than it was, and this is almost white. And that's an important thing to remember when we talk about hue and saturation. We have desaturated the color, in this case. Here, we've reduced the density. And it's a very important principle in color to understand. So when you desaturate, You reduce the purity of any particular color because you're actually overall adding light in, or dye in this particular case, in equal amounts. So the proportion of each particular color goes down, the purity of each particular color goes down. Again, both saturation and hue affect our perceptions, and this is an important situation to remember and understand. Let's move on. Readability and appropriateness are obviously important. I mean, if a message has to go across, and it's not simply readability in terms of text, readability in terms of images, readability of visuals is also important. But the text certainly needs to be legible. Your style should fit the content. Certainly certain types of fonts, if they're formal, if they're serious, go with certain types of text. If you were typing a legal document, if your document was about some very serious issue, you would not want flippant text to go with it. You wouldn't want something like Comic Sans or some other font which is seen to be much more light-hearted. One good thing to constantly remember is to look, to educate yourself, to train your eyes. Look at art. Look at nature. It's a great teacher. The color arrangements in nature are incredible. The visual arrangements in flowers, in arrangements, the shapes of leaves, it's phenomenal. It's worth remembering. Also look at advertising. Advertisers are very skilled people who spend a lot of time and effort in designing things so they work for the receiving audience. So it's worth learning from them. The fonts, we talked about typography. Typography isn't simply about shapes and letterings and relative proportions. It's also about fonts. And again, with fonts, you have serif or sans serif, and that really has to do with the little thing at the end that you have with certain fonts which you don't with others. I'll show you examples later. Again, some fonts are more formal than others. So depending upon your messaging, use the appropriate font. Use a font that fits. Some fonts are decorative, others are simple. A decorative font might well go well with a greeting card or a child's birthday party or something like that. If it's a serious announcement about an obituary or something else, you would certainly not want to be using decorative fonts there. So those are things to remember. I'll just digress a little bit because I do want to remind you about how important visuals are in perceptions. There was an interesting exercise that was conducted at one stage. A group of people in a room were asked to choose between two companies to work for. The two companies had two different motives, and one was represented by artwork by the Dutch master Mondrian. The other was by the painter Jackson Pollock. Now Jackson Pollock has very dynamic images with colors flowing everywhere. It's crazy and very energetic. And Mondrian is very stable, very serene. When asked, depending upon the personalities of the people, some chose a Mondrian type of company to work for, some chose a Pollock type of company to work for, depending upon who they were, what sort of environment they wanted to work within. The same people are then asked, here are the two logos of two different airlines. Do you want to fly in a Mondrian airline or a Pollock airline? Of course, no one went for the Pollock airline. They want to be safe. So while no words have been used, while there is no other messaging as such, merely the type of imagery creates associations in our minds which help our decision making. So it's very, very important to remember that. Hierarchy is an important part of how we get messages across. It helps people work out what the relative importance of things are. You put headlines, you put the body, you might have other things in between. If you're doing a PowerPoint presentation or something like that, you will choose how you place it. Again, in terms of news value, you will give a certain type of lettering, a certain type of treatment to the things that are most important. You will place things on the front page or the back page, depending upon their importance. You will hide things in the middle. Maybe you will have the important news on the front page along with a headline and continue later on. It's useful because it helps the reader prioritize. It guides the narrative. It helps them work out how they should flow through that text. Spacing is also important. There are two elements, leading and tracking, which relates to the overall spacing of a sentence, of letters in a sentence. But kerning is something which is letter specific. You will know, for instance, that the letter I is much thinner than the letter M or the letter W. Now, if both I and M occupied the same space, I would look strange. It would have gaps. It would be like broken teeth. So when people put an M and an I next to one another, they will have the I much closer to the M to allow for the fact that the I is a thinner letter. This is the sort of thing that's often used, but of course people can play with it as well, and particularly when it comes to layout, sometimes playing with it gives interesting options. Layout, composition and balance, that applies to photography, that applies to graphic design, but in terms of graphic design, it also allows the logic of what you're trying to say to come across. You talk about the intent. We did discuss it earlier on when we talked of hierarchy, but you can also use things like detail. Detail is also used in another case. Photographers use detail pictures to allow breakaway, to allow transitions. And detail, by sucking people in, also allows them mobility to move from one visual form to another. So these are things that talented designers use in many different ways. Scanability, we call scanners these days because we don't read anymore, we just glance through and then we decide what we will read, if we will read. So having a clear and ambiguous headline is extremely important. That's what's going to catch the eye. That's what will decide whether someone will turn the page or not, or stop. It also helps them know what they're going into. No one wants to read a whole long text and then find out they weren't really interested. If the headline's clear, gives a message across, then once you know whether you're going to go into it or not, and having made that decision, you then decide how you're going to navigate that space. Within the text itself, the intro should ideally be something that summarizes what's to follow. So again, the headline and the intro together gives people a taste of what is to come. And that way they know what territory they're going to go into or not. When it comes to effective writing, and it's not just true of writing, it's true of speech, it's true of photo essays, it's true across the board. Short, succinct things are the most powerful. They come across, they hit you hard, you remember them. Simplicity is useful because otherwise things get complicated, and people engage with simple things better. They remember them better. People have a finite capacity to relate to things, and if you give a large number of things, if you give a complicated idea, unless it's an expert who knows it well enough, who's prepared to come back, you will usually lose your audience. Context and detail, both are necessary. Context sets the scene, detail gives you the richness and the texture, but you need to find the balance of the two in order to be able to have effective writing. Let's move on. We're towards the end of our presentation today and talk about images themselves. For photojournalists, images are of course very important, and as I mentioned before, less is more. Less is more not only in terms of the space within which you place your images. Cluttering up a page with images does no justice to your images. Find which image works, give it the room that it needs, allow it to breathe, allow it to communicate. White space is important to give attention to what you want the eye to go to. White space can allow the eye to lead on to other things. And intelligent graphic designers will use negative space, white space in a way which directs the eye into the thing that you want. Let's not forget the other tools that we have at our disposal. We talked about color, we talked about text, we talked about images, but maps and illustrations are also very, very important. And there are times when they get an idea across far more simply. Complex, data-driven material often requires graphics to interpret. If you're talking about location-based text, location-based analysis, having a map which guides people into knowing the spatial relationships between the different elements of the story help. In terms of political issues, in terms of geopolitical issues, the regional maps, the specific maps, the relationship between one key area and another are all important things to remember. So that's quite a handful. We didn't go into everything. As I mentioned before, if we did, we would never be able to finish within our 20 minutes. But we did spend a little bit of time looking into color. It's worth remembering. And the fact that your audience is important, the design is important, the balance is important, the hierarchy is important, are all important things to remember. Thank you.